The death penalty, also known as capital punishment, has sparked fierce debates for centuries. It remains a contentious issue, with opinions divided on whether it is an appropriate and moral form of punishment. When you dig into this topic, the arguments on both sides reflect complex layers involving justice, morality, and the potential for errors. Let me walk you through why this issue is so multifaceted and whether it can ever truly be justified. Now think about this. You're sitting with a friend talking late into the night about whether the state should have the right to end a human life. Maybe your friend says that some crimes are so awful that the people who commit them deserve nothing less than death. But then you think about how irreversible that decision is. If the system makes even one mistake, the consequences are devastating. Let's explore why people are so divided on this. On one side, supporters of the death penalty argue that certain crimes are so horrifying that they warrant the ultimate punishment. When someone intentionally and brutally takes a life, many people feel that justice demands an equivalent response. For example, consider cases involving serial killers like Ted Bundy, who confessed to the murders of at least 30 young women. Bundy's crimes were heinous, calculated, and spread terror across states. For many, his execution in 1989 was not just a punishment, but a necessary act of justice that served to affirm the value of his victims' lives. Supporters argue that the death penalty acts as a deterrent. The idea is that the fear of facing execution might make potential criminals think twice before committing serious offenses. While the data on this is mixed, some studies have found that executions can have a short-term effect on reducing violent crime rates. For example, certain states in the US that carry out regular executions claim that it has deterred violent crime. However, this argument is contested by criminologists who argue that factors like socioeconomic conditions and effective policing play far larger roles in preventing crime. But here's where the issue becomes trickier. While proponents highlight justice and deterrence, opponents of the death penalty point to numerous real-life examples that challenge its fairness and morality. One of the most compelling arguments against capital punishment is the risk of wrongful conviction. The US alone has seen over 190 exonerations of death row inmates since 1973 due to new evidence or advancements in forensic science. Think about that. 190 people sentenced to death who were later found innocent. One chilling example is the case of Anthony Ray Hinton, who spent nearly 30 years on Alabama's death row before being exonerated in 2015 when ballistic tests used to convict him were proven inaccurate. Hinton's case shows that errors are not just possible, they happen. The death penalty also raises profound ethical and human rights concerns. Many believe that every human being, regardless of their crimes, has an inherent right to life. This belief is reflected in international human rights treaties, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which increasingly oppose capital punishment. In fact, over 70% of countries worldwide have either abolished the death penalty or have not carried out an execution in years, viewing it as an outdated practice incompatible with modern standards of justice and human rights. Another problem is that the application of the death penalty is not always fair. Studies have shown that racial and socioeconomic biases can play a significant role in who receives the death penalty. In the US, for example, black defendants are disproportionately sentenced to death, especially if the victim is white. A landmark study by Professor David Boulders found that defendants in Georgia were more than 4 times as likely to be sentenced to death if the victim was white than if the victim was black. These disparities suggest that the death penalty can perpetuate systemic inequalities rather than deliver impartial justice. This leads to a question of morality. Should a system that can be so deeply flawed be allowed to impose an irreversible punishment? The argument that mistakes are inevitable in any large system is particularly damning when that system decides matters of life and death. In a world where people are sometimes exonerated after decades of wrongful imprisonment, the finality of the death penalty looms large. When an execution takes place, any potential for correcting a wrongful conviction disappears forever. You might wonder, if the death penalty is so fraught with issues, why do some countries still use it? Part of the answer lies in the cultural and political landscape of these places. For instance, in countries like China and Iran, the death penalty is used not only for murder but for other serious crimes, including drug trafficking. These governments argue that strict punishment is necessary to maintain public order. However, critics argue that this can be a tool for exerting control and stifling dissent rather than genuinely reducing crime. One can't overlook the psychological toll on all involved. It's not just about the person being executed, but also about the impact on the prison staff who must carry out these orders. Former executioners have spoken about the emotional burden of their work, describing trauma and guilt that can last a lifetime. These stories highlight that capital punishment affects more than just the convicted individual. It ripples through communities, affecting families, victims, and even those tasked with upholding the law. So, is the death penalty ever justified? For some, the answer is yes, but only for the most extreme cases where the crime is so brutal that no other punishment feels adequate. For others, the answer is a resolute no, citing the possibility of errors, moral arguments, and the potential for unequal application. The debate is a mirror reflecting society's values, questioning how far we are willing to go in the name of justice and whether the potential benefits of the death penalty outweigh the risks of its misuse. What stands clear is that this debate isn't just academic or theoretical, it impacts real lives. The stories of those wrongfully convicted, the families of victims seeking justice, and the societies grappling with the weight of their moral choices all remind us that this issue is deeply human. The question of whether the death penalty is justified is ultimately a question about what kind of justice system we want to have and what price we're willing to pay to uphold it.